As soon as you put something on that, it immediately incites your curiosity about it. Oh, what could they have possibly done in here?
Their singer tried to escape the wrath of Lemmy Kilmister by jumping off a stage in front of 10,000 people. Whilst the likes of Metallica and Slayer were thrashing it up, these guys were conjuring up their own brand of power thrash. Although they tried to follow the theatrics of Kiss, the mighty Cliff Burton would actually set them on the true path to greatness. And of course, they couldn't sit back and watch the PMRC try to destroy the very music they were so passionate about. Their story, though, isn't all mosh pits and six-packs, as Bobby Blitz would be diagnosed with cancer during a difficult time for the group, and they were almost wiped out by grunge in the same era. This is Feel the Fire, the story of Overkill.
Back to the Headbangers Ball, and right now we are joined with Bobby and Rob from the band Overkill.
Overkill would officially form in 1981 from the remnants of a punk band called the Lubricants that featured, amongst others, Carlo Di Verni and Lee Rat Skates. Then with Bobby Blitz Ellsworth on vocals, this early trio would start to find their way across the heavy metal landscape. Seemingly, the Lubricants didn't release anything bar one demo cassette in 1980 called Reign of Terror, which doesn't appear to exist online. However, you can at least see a picture of it in the liner notes of Overkill's 1995 live album, Wrecking Your Neck. So we definitely have some punk origins within the camp of Overkill. New Jersey is where Overkill would be born and where Bobby Blitz would grow up. His mother was actually a singer. I was a suburban kid, like most metal kids are in the US. Me and Dee Dee both had professional fathers. My grandparents were immigrants, so were Dee Dee's. New Jersey has always been second to New York. People in Jersey had a great work ethic and a hell of an attitude. It's the most attitude-fueled place I've ever seen in my life. The first voice I remember hearing was my mother's. She was a soprano. She had 12 brothers and sisters. Our family Sundays were them singing harmonies around the fireplace, so it was a natural thing for me. And as with almost every metal band that formed around this era, punk origins or not, there were your standard influences such as Judas Priest, and for a vocalist, naturally Rob Halford. Although Bobby learned of his incredibly high-powered shrieking in a rather interesting way. I was sitting on the beach in a bathing suit and I dropped a cigarette on my lap. I just started trying it at rehearsals. I was originally trying to mimic Rob Halford. The benchmark for a singer in the early 80s was, could you do Priest's Green Manalishi? And I could do it. It kind of became my trademark. Although this song was actually taken from Judas Priest's 1978 record Hellbent for Leather, or Killing Machine, depending on which country you saw it released in, the song Green Manalishi itself is a cover of Fleetwood Mac, a song they released way back in 1969. And as I just mentioned, we absolutely had some punk inspirations here within the Overkill camp. They essentially started out trying to nail some Judas Priest covers, but also decided to try and mix in their love for punk groups such as the Ramones, Misfits, and even Dead Boys. We obviously noticed the energy we'd been coming along at the same time, and we were much more into the punk rock end of things and fusing it with traditional British metal. We were Misfits fans, we were Dead Boys fans, we were Ramones fans, but you start doing some Priest covers with that, and you start creating a third entity. Dead Boys are a group I don't think I've ever heard mentioned when it comes to a predominantly thrash-orientated band like Overkill being cited as an influence. Dead Boys were an absolutely iconic punk rock group from Cleveland, Ohio. In my opinion, they released one of the greatest punk rock records ever, Young, Loud and Snotty, in 1977.
I don't need anyone, don't need no mama, just wanna get out on the street spots, just like you go find yourself a factory now.
The title track for this record would be Sonic Reducer, and Overkill actually recorded a cover of this song, which you'll see on some pressings of their debut record. And this kind of reflects more than just Dead Boys from this era. There was an entire punk scene and ethos around this time, and it wasn't leather jackets and mohawks. It was a different kind of punk attitude over the traditional punk image most people associate with today. I think it's safe to say that this was an era where people valued attitude as opposed to wearing a patch of a band, you hardly know anything about. This was when punk was an actual lifestyle, not a fashion statement on social media. I was taking these classes in Manhattan, specifically going there because the punk thing was happening at the time. It was a cool scene. There was a lot more than just the Ramones and early Blondie. There was television, Heartbreakers, which had Johnny Thunders, who'd also been in New York Dolls, some really avant-garde stuff. It was like being in Freakville. I think that was a huge motivation for me. I didn't really live the punk lifestyle, but I loved being around it because it just felt so free and dangerous. You were either going to get laid or mugged, and you didn't know which one it was on any given night. Overkill went through a few lineup alterations during their early phase, with one including Dan Spitz, who would go on to join the legendary Anthrax. And I can't help but see some Kiss vibes in this promo picture from 1982. And you can thank Cliff Burton for convincing Overkill to not go down this route after a show with Metallica in 1984. The lineup of Overkill started with the guitar player who brought Bobby Ellsworth. That was in 1981 when I drew the logo and the band started. It was in late 81 that we started with the makeup and theatrical horror show stuff, from late 81 until it started to slowly go away. Yeah, we were hanging with Metallica doing a show with them, and Cliff is looking at Blitz putting on his makeup saying, "What are you doing with that shit on your face?" All these little things led to us not doing the theatrical makeup and stuff anymore, just like Slayer. Many years into their career, Overkill released an album of cover songs that included a version of Juice by Kiss, originally released back in 1974, taken from Kiss's debut record from the same year. This cover album also featured a version of Overkill by Motorhead, which is safe to say where the name for Overkill came from for the band itself. Although they did flirt with the idea of calling themselves Virgin Killer based on the 1976 Scorpions record Virgin Killer, they only played one show under that moniker. And also on this album of Overkill influence is a song called Death Tone by Manowar, a band that gets a lot of shit in the world of heavy metal. I mean, it's not surprising when you see how they dress, but they do actually have some great records. Tone would originally be released on Manowar's debut studio album Battle Hymns in 1982. A year after this record was released by Manowar, Overkill recorded their first demo cassette called Power in Black.
One of the bands that I really have to give a lot of credit to is, in fact, a band called Overkill.
It featured 5 songs, and in the liner notes it said, "This demo recorded and mixed March and September at 2 shitholes, Staten Island, NY, and Sterling, NJ. Listening to that demo cassette, it's difficult to imagine any mixing at all took place. It's basically just a wall of unfiltered noise. And you can see from the promo picture on the cover the type of aesthetic Overkill were aiming for. It's kind of a mix of Venom meets Judas Priest in a dark alleyway with lots of lube. During the early 80s, Overkill would become a regular fixture at a legendary venue called Lemoore in Brooklyn. We were a totally self-promoted band. We'd wear out our Converse putting flyers into windshield wipers, and we would constantly go to these 2 guys and give them packages. I remember it being my turn, and I walked up to one of them, and he goes, "Listen kid, I've got 40 of your packages on my desk. You're a nice kid, but your band sucks." A year later, we were the house band in the place. They had a legal capacity of about 1,200 people at Lemoore in Brooklyn, and an average Overkill show would hold about 1,750. An average Metallica show would hold 2,200. It was insane. It was dick to ass, all the way to the back of the room, but the whole thing just pulsed. 1985 would see the release of 2 notable records from Overkill, their debut studio album and their debut EP. I have to assume their EP came first, as the copyright on the back states 1984. It's a self-titled EP released by Metal Storm Records. Although it's a great EP for the time, the group never received a single dime from its release. Thank the record label for that. Shock. Luckily, the mighty Megaforce Records would come to the rescue and release Overkill's debut studio album, Feel the Fire. Megaforce had already released Kill 'Em All and Ride the Lightning by Metallica, Fistful of Metal by Anthrax, Melissa by Merciful Fate, and Manowar's 1983 LP, Into Glory Ride. Although Feel the Fire is officially labeled as a straight-up thrash record, you can absolutely hear elements of new wave of British metal, and even a raw edge of punk to a certain extent. And dare I say it, a hint of Manowar. And combined with the album artwork, it definitely stood out amongst the other thrash groups and albums of this era. There's some brilliant young man angst on those records. I was torn between 2 or 3 things. I was a university student down in the city, I was writing lyrics for Overkill, and I was a huge fan of the punk scene. So when I hear Feel the Fire, I hear all that. I hear my literary courses I was taking, stealing stuff right out of Shakespeare in there. I hear the punk that I would see down at Max's, and I hear the desire to be a songwriter. Feel the Fire didn't land the group any huge commercial success, however, it did help to put Overkill in the spotlight, and they would soon find themselves touring with the one and only Slayer.
I mean, you go to a little divey piece of shit club, man, and you got an Overkill show.
In 1986, one of the greatest thrash metal records ever recorded would take the world by storm. It wasn't Overkill though. Sorry guys.
A little lady that lives 6 feet underground in your nearest cemetery. Just bring her along and I'll enjoy myself.
It was Slayer's Rain in Blood. This was Slayer's 3rd studio album and gave them their first Billboard chart position, and Overkill would be there to celebrate it. Overkill would join Slayer on their European tour, alongside their own headlining shows that saw the group dominate Germany, Switzerland, Belgium, amongst others, and saw them share stages with Venom and even Anthrax. This was also a very politically charged time for music. The PMRC, or Parents Music Resource Center, had formed a year prior in 1985 with the goal of essentially censoring music and lyrics that they deemed to be harmful to minors. They targeted Wasp, Judas Priest, Black Sabbath, and Venom, along with Madonna. So of course, many groups not on the list also felt the pressure of this, including Overkill. They decided to release an EP called Q in 1987. The title song, which was originally released by UK punk band Subhumans back in 1979, once again highlighted this close punk connection with Overkill's origins. And this was essentially a political statement made by Overkill in response to the attempted censorship ongoing within heavy metal music. It was our only political statement. Al Gore and his wife Tipper created the PMRC, and it was all over the news that records were going to be stickered and banned. It could have been called Ban This. Most stores sold it in a black wrapped cover or in craft paper. Some retail outlets had the nuts to just put it out. It was young men waving the flag of their own freedoms. Although this quest for censorship completely backfired, because thanks to this little sticker, every teenager in America now knew exactly which records to buy. And that's exactly what they did with Overkill's 2nd album. Released in 1987, Taking Over would showcase more of Overkill's unique sounds of thrash mixed with new wave of British heavy metal, but they were actually being labeled as power metal by the likes of MTV's Headbangers Ball, which they didn't seem to have any issues with.
It's one of America's premier power metal bands, Overkill.
And you really only have to listen to the album to hear all of these influences that have been fused together by Overkill to create their very distinguished sound. This wasn't straight up thrash, it was diverse heavy metal, dare I say it, even somewhat experimental power thrash. Power thrash generally isn't an officially recognized genre, however Taking Over is a seriously good example of what power thrash would sound like. Regardless of how you want to label this era of Overkill, they were displaying a much more technical approach to thrash than most of their contemporaries of the time. And if we compare this record to the likes of, say, Rain in Blood or Master of Puppets, two premier thrash records from the same era, well, there's a clear sonic distinction that you just can't argue about. And interestingly, they were taking this record out on the road with Megadeth. However, thanks to the likes of MTV's Headbangers Ball, Overkill found their own little corner of thrash to mark as their own. What happened was Headbangers Ball, as you knew it, turned into subgenres. Prior, it was Def Leppard and Poison. By the time 87 came along, it was Creator, Slayer, and Overkill. There was a different formula for metal, so if you couldn't get to Kentucky, if you couldn't get to Montana, if you couldn't get to Boise, Idaho, you were still exposed at a high level through video. That's really where the mainstream exposure came from. 1987 would see Megadeth embark on their Wake Up Dead tour in support of their second studio album, Peace Sells. Overkill joined them for several shows on this tour in America, but also shared the stage with Helloween over in Germany. Helloween had already released their debut studio album, Walls of Jericho, in 1985, and it was officially labeled as heavy metal, but of course had a power metal edge to it. So not only did you have Overkill showcasing their thrash and power metal crossover sound on record, they could also traverse both genres on stage to a mixed audience. And whilst this seems like a pretty epic talent from a musical perspective, I honestly think this is why Overkill struggled to see the same commercial success as groups such as Megadeth, Metallica, and Slayer. Fans didn't really know what the band actually was. They were maybe a little bit ahead of their time.
Going out with Helloween and going out with Anthrax before that, immediately anybody who hasn't heard your music will go, aha, thrash metal. Would you agree with that? No.
I hate the classifications. I mean, everybody gets classified. We just consider ourselves music and straightforward, go for it, aggressive music. But you get thrown into the categories by people who are listening.
Despite the success of their first two studio albums, Rat Skates would decide to part ways with the group in 1987, and seemingly a very tough decision for him to make. Well, when I left, leaving the band was my decision, and a very difficult one to make. At the time, I was very discouraged with the music industry, and that kept me from doing music professionally. When I left Overkill, I was extremely frustrated and pissed off about how things were run in the music industry, and I still am. None of that has changed in the music business. I left because of my dissatisfaction with the road and the business, which eventually resulted in me abusing alcohol. I left everything to my bandmates. I didn't take anything, didn't sign my way out of it contractually, which was my mistake. I said, these are my friends, and I just can't do this anymore, guys. It has had a punishing effect on my life. It really did, and it's hard to talk about. I thought if these guys want to continue with Overkill, I'm not going to stop them. So the once classic Overkill lineup was now fractured, leaving Bobby Blitz, Bobby Gustafson, and Dee Dee Verney to try and power through the rest of the decade. Although certainly a blow to the band, losing such an integral founding member, this would be the early rebirth of Overkill.
Hundreds of thousands of teenagers are locked onto so-called heavy metal music.
The late 80s were the pinnacle of thrash metal. The genre had stormed through the decade and saw the likes of Slayer, Metallica, and Megadeth become absolute giants. And not just within thrash, but the music industry as a whole. By 1988, Metallica's And Justice for All had smashed number 6 on the Billboard 200. Slayer's South of Heaven reached number 57, and Megadeth landed at number 28 with So Far, So Good. So what? Thrash was a global phenomenon, and Overkill were almost within reach of the same success. Overkill would release their third full-length studio album, Under the Influence, in 1988. It debuted on Billboard July the 30th of this year, peaked at number 142, and spent 13 weeks on the charts. Thanks to heavy support from Headbangers Ball and their single, Hello from the Gutter, Overkill were just on the verge of seeing a big commercial breakthrough. Hello from the Gutter once again showcased the diverse influences that had helped Overkill develop a sound that really did separate them from the general thrash movement. Songs like Drunken Wisdom, Head First, and End of the Line even changed the entire feel of the record from thrash. We knew we were different, and we thought of that as a good thing. We weren't being lumped into the whole scene as we developed. Under the Influence disappointed me a little bit, but by the Years of Decay, it came to fruition. We became a purely identifiable thing. But again, this constant need to push the boundaries of the genres they were trying to fuse together most likely would have alienated a lot of the general thrashcore audience. Maybe. There is no fact to back up this statement, it's more just a theory as to why I personally feel they never fully broke through that commercial barrier. And then the group seemingly started to fall apart. Overkill's fourth studio album, The Years of Decay, released in 1989, would be the final record to feature Bobby Gustafson, who had been with the group since their 1983 demo, Power in Black. The reasoning for Bobby leaving the band after this record has always been told from two different sides, but ultimately seems to have boiled down to money. I was not asked to leave the band. It wasn't something where they came out and said, hey, you're fired. It was more of a verbal fight between me and Dee Dee about doing a show where they wanted to do it strictly for money, and I didn't want to do it because we had just sold out Studio 54 in New York, our biggest show, and they wanted to do a Halloween show that was kind of goofy. They wanted to charge full price, which at the time was about $15 or $20. I said that it wasn't right and that we should either not do the show or keep it half price because it's not a real Overkill show. One thing led to another, and I hadn't talked to Dee Dee for 2 weeks, so I knew that something was up. I later found out that he was doing stuff behind my back with the management, trying to get me out of the band, pretty much. Regardless of the real intricate reasons as to why this split happened, it really was an absolute shame. Not just for the second fracture in the band, but also for the fact that Bobby Gustafson brought a truly memorable sound to Overkill, and in my opinion, was a seriously underrated guitar player from this era, of not just the group, but the entire heavy metal genre. Years of Decay somehow only managed to reach number 155 on the Billboard chart, which is honestly just mind-blowing to me. It debuted on the 18th of November 1989 and only spent 8 weeks on the chart, dropping out in February of 1990. The album itself was produced by Terry Date, who famously went on to work with Pantera for Cowboys from Hell and Vulgar Display of Power, amongst many, many other great records, but now we're in the 1990s. Overkill would follow the same fate as many thrash and heavy metal groups from this era. The era of grunge. They now had a new lineup with 2 guitarists that would stick around for the next 3 studio albums. Horoscope in 1991, I Hear Black in 1993, and WFO in 1994. I Hear Black would actually be their highest charting album of this era, landing at number 122 on Billboard. The other 2 albums, though, didn't even chart. Of course, as I've mentioned time and time again in my coverage of thrash, if you didn't adapt during this era, you died. Metallica were the prime example of this. By 1991, the Black Album helped to push a more commercially friendly, heavy metal sound to the mainstream. And grunge basically took out any remnants of traditional thrash music from the airwaves. The 90s is one of the proudest eras of Overkill. It's when we got the hair on our balls. One day, there were 200 thrash fans in a room sharing a draft beer. The next day, there were 8. And we happened to be 4 of them. We thought to ourselves, if we want to do this, we have to retool this thing or just go home, live in our parents' basements and wonder why nobody appreciates our genius. In 1994, there was a crowded room, so many different kinds of metal and thrash bands that were out there performing, but by 97, that room had shrunk to next to nothing. It was being stomped out by a depressive type of grunge approach to things. Despite the drastic shift in popularity, Overkill powered through and continued to release great thrash-orientated music. They also appeared on Beavis and Butthead in 1994, but unfortunately, they got ripped to shreds.
It's too bad this music sucks.
Bobby Blitz was honestly lucky to even make it through the 90s at all. In 1998, he was diagnosed with cancer, and then he had a stroke on stage. But even in light of this, he found humor in it. He said he suffered more damage falling down the stairs due to the stroke, but he was back on his bike within a couple of weeks, and even joked he could only turn left. But it did take him 4 hours to get home. One story I've always found hilarious from the history of Overkill is when they toured with Motorhead. Lemmy Kilmister invited Bobby on stage to sing Overkill with them. Of course, he knew the words off by heart, but was seemingly terrified to be sharing the stage with the mighty Lemmy. Who wouldn't be? We did a triple bill across the US, which was Slayer, Motorhead, and Overkill, and I think the record they were doing was 1916. It was when they had two guitarists, Phil Campbell and Wurzel, and Lemmy, obviously, and Filthy Animal Taylor on drums. We were in Germany on the last show, and my light guy, Big Eric, says, "Lemmy wants to see you for a few minutes." Lemmy goes to me, "I want you to sing Overkill with me tonight." I go, "Fuck, this is going to be great. I know the song cold, but I was nervous. Now I'm doing it with the guy who wrote the song. I wrote the first word of each verse on my forearm. Once you have the first verse, you're in." Sure enough, he catches me in the middle of the song and yells right into my microphone, "Cheat notes," in front of 10,000 crazy Motorhead bangers in Berlin. I totally panicked and dived into the audience. I can imagine Lemmy just laughed his ass off and kept going, whilst Bobby Blitz squirmed his way through the crowd as fast as he could. Probably to the bar. To date, Overkill have released an incredible 20 studio albums, with their latest being Scorched back in 2023. However, these early years really highlighted their defiance. They chose to not conform to the normal notions of thrash or heavy metal. They took their sound and made it their own, and what's great about this attitude is it really paid off in the end. With the resurgence of thrash that we've seen in recent years, Overkill have experienced some of their greatest commercial success, with albums such as Electric Age from 2012 and White Devil Armory in 2014. So all these years later, Overkill have left their mark, and we can all still feel the fire.